Hey, what's up guys? It's Bonechill Files back again, with the story of the charming monster behind the mask, Ted Bundy. In part 1, we left off with the haunting image of Linda's blood-stained pillow. But who will be the next unfortunate victim? Will Ted Bundy's story end here in part 2, or is this just the beginning? The answer lies within this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep us going, so we can bring you more chilling stories like this one. Several days later on March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Manson left her dorm room at Evergreen State College around 7 p.m. to walk to a jazz concert on campus. When she failed to return, she wasn't immediately reported as missing, due to her tendency of taking off on a whim for several days at a time. She was last seen wearing a blue slacks, a red, orange, and green striped top and a black maxi coat, as well as a Bulova wristwatch and an oval brown agate ring. She was never seen alive again. On that day, Bundy's dated law school notes indicated he did not attend class that day. Prior to this, his attendance was regular, however his absence was becoming more sporadic throughout March, and by April he had stopped attending altogether. In his later confessions, Ted Bundy would speculate on meeting Donna Manson at a local tavern and said the two went back her house, drank alcohol, and had consensual sex before he murdered her. He would admit to bludgeoning her with a crowbar, strangling her, and then having sex with her corpse. She was then decapitated and her body was dumped at the Taylor Mountain site, where most of his victims' remains would later be found. Manson was reported missing by her friends on March 18, 6 days after her disappearance. By April, Bundy escalated his stalking, and several women would report to police their strange encounter with the handsome young man on a darkened evening. On April 12, Good Friday, a sorority girl was approached outside a campus library by a man with his arm in a sling and a metal brace on his finger. She told detectives he appeared to be having trouble carrying his armload of books, dropping several of them. She offered her assistance and escorted the man to his Volkswagen Bug parked 300 yards away. When they arrived at the car, she noticed the front passenger seat was bizarrely missing. They chatted for several minutes about how he injured his arm skiing at Crystal Mountain, and then the girl felt the urge to get away. She placed the books on the roof of the vehicle and run. On April 17, at about 7 p.m., a young man was seen on crutches at Ellensburg, Washington by several witnesses. A sorority girl was approached by the man asking for help carry his books, and she readily agreed to help because of his handicap. When they approached his car, she recounted for the police how she noticed the passenger seat was missing and sensed something wasn't right and dropped the books and ran. The son of an Oregon district attorney who was visiting the campus reported seeing a man with his arm in a sling standing in front of the Bartow Hall around 8:30 p.m. on the same evening. Later at about 10 p.m. another sorority girl was approached by a man asking for help. When they arrived at his parked car, he dropped the keys on the floor and asked her to retrieve them. This was a ruse used by Ted Bundy, who waited until his victim knelt down to look for them, and then bludgeoned them in the head with a crowbar he had hidden under the wheel arch. When the girl said she could see the light shining on the keys on the ground, she picked them up and placed them in his hand and walked away. That same evening, 18-year-old Susan Rancourt left a meeting with one of her advisors about a potential job at 9 p.m. and had made plans to watch a German film with a friend, but she never arrived. She was last seen walking across Central Washington State College lawns around 10:30 p.m. Susan Rancourt never ventured outside at night alone, except for this one time. At some point she encountered Ted Bundy using his crutches as a ruse to gain her trust, and possibly dropping his keys to knock her unconscious. She was reported missing immediately, and police were told she was last seen wearing a yellow short-sleeved sweater, gray corduroy slacks, a yellow coat and brown hush puppy shoes. During that evening a Volkswagen Beetle, similar to the one owned by Ted Bundy, was seen parked at Taylor Mountain. The following month another young woman would disappear without trace, this time in Corvallis, Oregon. At 10 p.m., 20-year-old Roberta Parks decided to walk to another dorm hall to have coffee with friends on May 6, but never arrived. Along the way she came across Ted Bundy using his handicapped ruse to get her to help him. There were no witnesses to her abduction, and no one reported seeing anything out of the ordinary the evening she vanished. Corvallis is 250 miles south of Seattle, and that day Bundy cashed 2 checks for a total of $20, which would be more than sufficient to cover the cost of the 500-mile round trip. It was during this period that Ted's credit card receipts reveal he did a large amount of driving, far more than a cash-strapped student whose carpooling responsibilities should have restricted his traveling to the 60-mile round trip from Seattle to Tacoma each week. It was during May 1974 when Ted's girlfriend Liz first noticed the crutches in his room. Ted told her they belonged to Ernst Rogers, the landlord who rented the room to Ted. Because he needed a summer job, Ted drove down to Olympia and secured work at Washington State Department of Emergency Services. He was paid $722 a month for working 5 days a week, and overtime if required. On May 23, he started work at the Olympia office and his arrival caught the attention of the female employees. Bundy was assigned to work on the DES biennial budget alongside Larry Diamond, who remembered how Ted presented a handsome figure at the office and became a mentor to him, explaining how the politics of GOP administration worked. He also recalled how Ted Bundy kept an air of mystery, revealing very little about himself to his colleagues. That same day, Liz's parents came to visit them and on Memorial Day, May 27, they all went for a picnic at Dungeon Spit. On May 31, Liz, her parents and Ted go for pizza and then he dropped everyone home by 9 p.m. because the next day was the baptism of Liz's daughter. It was this evening that a young Kappa Alpha Theta sorority girl was accosted by a man asking for help with his belongings. However, as they reached his car, he turned to her and said, "Thank you, see you later." Bundy would later explain to detectives that he did this on several occasions, where he thought, "No, I don't want to do this," and allowed his intended victim to escape unharmed. In the early morning hours of June 1, Bundy came across 22-year-old Brenda Ball at the Flame Tavern in Burien. Ball had told friends she was going there to find a ride to Sun Lakes, asking one of the musicians around 2 a.m. at closing time, but he was unable to help. She was last seen talking to a young man with his arm in a sling, who turned out to be Bundy using his usual abduction technique. She wasn't reported missing until 19 days after her disappearance, when his friends realized she hadn't made it to Sun City. In his later confessions, he admitted to bludgeoning Ball with a crowbar, before handcuffing her and placing her body in his Volkswagen and taking her to his apartment. The next day Ted attended Liz's daughter's baptism, which took place at 5 p.m., and afterwards he slept at Liz's house until 11 p.m. She later told police he told her he was very tired and slept on her rug that evening. On June 5, Bundy removed Ball's body from his apartment and dumped her remains at Taylor Mountain. The sudden rash of missing women did not go unnoticed by detectives from the King County and Seattle police departments. But with little evidence, apart from various witness statements about the young man with his arm in a sling asking for help, there wasn't anything connecting the young women, apart from them all being attractive, white college students who all wore their hair parted in the middle. Another sorority girl would come forward and report to police how a man approached her wearing crutches as they was walking outside the Phi Sigma Sigma sorority houses at 11 p.m. on June 11. She said one leg of his jeans had been cut up the side and he appeared to have a full cast on his leg. She offered her help so long as he didn't mind waiting whilst she went into one of the houses for a few minutes. When she came outside, the man was gone. This was the same evening that 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins vanished. Hawkins had been to a party and left to say goodnight to her boyfriend and borrow some textbooks for her upcoming Spanish exam. As she walked behind the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority house, a friend called out to her and they chatted for a few minutes. She then left and continued to walk the 30 feet or more back to her dorm, when some male friends remembered seeing her walking the last 20 feet and then she rounded a corner. She never made it home that night. When Georgianne failed to return home, her roommate realized something was wrong and called Georgianne's boyfriend, who said she left his place at 1 a.m. They reported her disappearance in the morning, and the Seattle police reacted immediately because of the rise in young missing women. They learned that a dorm mother heard screams during the night, but thought it was students fooling around. Bundy would later recount the murder of Georgianne Hawkins for detectives, using his third-person perspective so he could avoid directly implicating himself. Bundy said the killer met Georgianne at around 1:30 a.m., just outside her dorm, and using his handicap ruse, he lured her into helping him carry his briefcase to his car because of his fake cast. When they arrived at his car, he knocked her unconscious with the hidden crowbar and handcuffed her before placing her inside his Volkswagen. He then sped away and recalled how she regained consciousness and began rambling incoherently, asking if he had been sent to help her with her Spanish exam. He then knocked her out again, then pulled over and strangled her. He indicated he drove to Issaquah, where he raped her and severed her head, burying it in the woods. Whilst driving back, he threw all her belongings out of the window. In a moment of sheer panic, he returned up the I-90 freeway and retrieved all her clothing, except for one shoe he could not find. The next day, at 5 p.m. he rode on his bicycle back up the I-90 to the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority house to locate Hawkins' missing shoe, which he found in the parking lot where he abducted her along with her earring. The next day, the area of Hawkins' abduction was searched by 3 homicide detectives and a criminalist from the Seattle Police Department, who found no evidence of her whereabouts. Witnesses came forward to describe how they saw a man on crutches with his leg in a cast, carrying a briefcase. The authorities suspected the 6 women who had been reported missing were somehow linked to one another, because the circumstances of each case was very similar, with all being young women who were last seen in the evening, and most were seen in the company of a handicapped young man who was reportedly seen by multiple witnesses. However, detectives could offer little to the press for fear of compromising the investigation. 2 days after the murder, Ted Bundy returned to the Issaquah site to revisit the crime scene and engaged in necrophilia with Hawkins' decapitated head. He also had sex with her corpse and checked for any visible evidence. 2 weeks later, on June 28, he would return for a third time before decomposition prevented him from doing anything further. On July 6, Ted and Liz went river rafting. She would later recall the incident that sunny day in her own book. Both had been drinking beers and were drifting along the river quietly, when Ted suddenly lunged at her and pushed her into the water. She came up shocked and irritated, and shouted at him. She remembers he looked at her coldly and shrugged his shoulders and said, "It was no big deal, can't you take a joke?" The next day, Ted told Liz he was invited to a water skiing part at Lake Sammamish State Park. However, several people who knew Bundy from Republican Party functions recalled seeing him there, walking along the beach alone. When they asked him what he was doing, he replied, "Just walking around." He then declined to join them when they invited him skiing, saying he had no shorts. Over the next 3 days, Bundy worked at the DES office but then called in sick to his supervisor Neil Miller, telling him he could not come into work because he had a cold. Several days later, on July 13, Liz telephoned Ted, who was staying with friends in Tacoma, to ask him to see her the next day. He told her he couldn't, giving her the excuse he had things to do. When she asked him what things, he replied, "Just things, Liz." The next morning, Ted arrived unexpectedly at her home, asking Liz what her plans were for the day. She said he seemed eager to know where she was going. That day, Sunday, July 14, had been a hot and sunny day at Lake Sammamish, which was located 12 miles from downtown Seattle. Hundreds of people flocked there to enjoy the summer weather, with most either on the beach, walking their dogs, sailing boats, or enjoying picnics. At around 12:15 p.m., a 22-year-old woman enjoying the sun was approached by a man with his arm in a sling who called himself Ted. He asked her for help in loading his sailboat, which was located in the parking lot. The young woman accompanied him to his tan Volkswagen Beetle but then made her excuses and left. The man was seen walking back in the direction of the beach. At 12:25 p.m., 23-year-old Janice Ott was approached by the man with his arm in a sling. Ott had gone to Lake Sammamish State Park without her husband that day, as he had stayed on at practice in Riverside, and left a note for her roommate, telling her she had gone for a bike ride. Several witnesses reported seeing Otto briefly chatting with a handsome young man who had a broken arm, before they both walked off together. A little after 4 p.m. the young man was back at the lake and was seen chatting to several other women. One young woman declined his request for help, and a 16-year-old girl was approached by a man with his arm in a sling at the park restrooms at 4:15 p.m. He asked her for help, and when she declined he tugged on her arm insistently before she walked off. "19-year-old Denise Naslund was having a picnic with friends when she wandered off to the restrooms when the others fell asleep. At 4:40 p.m. she bumped into a young man who asked her for help in loading his sailboat onto his car. Bundy would speculate years later on death row how he had first taken Janice Ott, leading her away from the park to a nearby house and raped her. He then returned to the park and abducted Denise Naslund, taking her to the house where she was raped in full view of Ott. Both girls were then killed and taken to a remote spot 4 miles northeast of the park. Ted then spent the evening with Liz, and remembered how tired he looked that day and how hungry he was when they went for burgers in Seattle. When the news broke about the 2 young women who went missing at Lake Sammamish State Park, police interviewed dozens of potential witnesses who remembered seeing the young man with the broken arm who called himself Ted. Soon a composite of the suspect was compiled and released to the public. After Bundy returned to work at the DES office, the Seattle Times released the composite drawing on Monday, July 22. His colleagues remembered Bundy took a great deal of banter from those in the office, such as Alice Thiessen, Larry Diamond and Carol Boone, who all commented how much the composite of Ted resembled Bundy. They joked, "Gee Ted, you sure look a lot like that guy, and you own a Volkswagen." Bundy's name was reported to police as a possible suspect by a DES employee, his former coworker and Rule, a UW professor, and his own girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer. She was now both fearful of what her boyfriend might be capable of, and apprehensive over his coming departure to Utah. Numerous incidents brought doubt into her mind about his involvement in the recent disappearances of young women. One time she found a hatchet under the seat of his car, whilst another she came across an eyeglass case with a bewildering assortment of keys inside. After a brief trip to Utah, Ted returned and Liz discovered he had cut his long hair short. She remembered how it dramatically transformed his appearance. Working at the DES office and attempting to keep his murderous acts hidden were beginning to take its toll on Ted's health. Carol Boone remembered how Ted lost 15 pounds whilst working on the complex budget which he had to finish before his move to Utah. The situation was made worse when a cleaning lady threw out a box full of Ted's budget documents. He would often approach his work in much the same way he had with his college work. He would work haphazardly, and for several days he would hit the budget hard, then lose interest and do nothing. On September 1, 1974, his last evening in the Northwest was spent at the DES office with Liz, when in the early morning hours he finally completed the budget.
So our journey will not stop at part 2, the next unfortunate victims of the villain will be in part 3. If you like this series, please like, share, and subscribe to follow the latest developments of this case with Bone Chill Files.